go. Testing, testing. Hey, looks like we are live. We invite you to come on into the room. Take this time to share this broadcast as we are getting ready to get started. We want to welcome you to the Empower West Louisville City-wide Book Club. So go ahead, take this time right now, share this broadcast, and make plans to join us for the rest of the evening. This is going to be good. Well, good evening, everyone. We hope that you are warm and safe wherever you may find yourself on this Tuesday evening. And we thank God for virtual because rain, sleet, hail, or snow, we were still going to be able to have this event. Thank God we could do it virtually. We want to welcome you to the Empower West and the Empower West Citywide Book Club, and this is brought to you by Empower West and Simmons College of Kentucky. I am your host, Miss Crystal Goodner-Spratt, the Director of Communications for Simmons College of Kentucky. Again, please share this broadcast. And again, we thank you so much for spending your Tuesday evening with us. As racial tensions reached a fever pitch in our country over the summer, and we're still dealing with the reverberating effects of the racism stirred up by the former administration. Tonight, we're going to delve into the fourth and final book of one of our nation's greatest civil rights champions, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this book title poses a question that seems relevant right now, today. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? I'm going to turn you over to our wonderful moderator for today's, it's President's Day, and we are I'm excited to shout out our president of Simmons College of Kentucky, the great Reverend Dr. Kevin W. Cosby.
Well, thank you so very much, Crystal. And to all who are participating in what I know will be a very lively and intellectually stimulating, emotionally motivating dialogue with some brilliant scholars. I would like, on behalf of my colleagues in Empower West and the Simmons College Nation, to welcome you to this discussion on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Dr. King, we cannot get enough of him. We just celebrated his birthday, and here we are again in the month of February talking about Dr. King again. And the reason we can't get enough is because, for one reason, Dr. King has been so watered down, so housebroken and domesticated that the historic Dr. King has been lost and replaced by a mythological Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The fact of the matter is, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, said that Dr. King was the most dangerous man in America. And the reason he was dangerous was because he was calling for more than blacks and whites getting along and liking each other, but he was calling for real transformative structural change so that all persons might have access to opportunity and humanity. They might experience humanity in the richest nation in the world. And we still have not come to grips with that radical king. And so I'd like to welcome our participants who will be engaging us in Dr. King's last work. Dr. Gerald Smith, who is a King scholar at the University of Kentucky, professor of history at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Erica Whitaker, soon to be Dr. Erica Whitaker, candidate for the PhD, and brilliant writer, and has a heart for justice for marginalized people. And looking forward to hearing from Erica. And then also our own Dr. Lewis Brogdon, who is both a professor at Simmons College, Kentucky, and the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, and last semester did a remarkable class, virtual class on the radical Martin Luther King Jr. So I'd like to welcome our guests. Thank you for your brilliance, your scholarship, and what you'll be contributing to this conversation. I'd like to welcome the entire national community as we enter into an important dialogue on this critical issue of where will we go from here. And it's our choice. America has a choice. The world has a choice. Will we go? Will we move in the direction of chaos, or will we move in the direction of community? So, on behalf of Simmons College of Kentucky, welcome to this discussion.
Good evening, friends. We are so glad to be able to have some moments to dive deep into one of the seminal texts of American history. And I have it right here. I hope I hope you have your copy with you. You need to go ahead and grab your pen. You need to get a highlighter, maybe a piece of paper so that you can kind of take some notes in the margins, because, a part of my passion in teaching Dr. King is to really move the country beyond the caricature of Dr. King, but to really challenge us to engage his ideas, because it's the ideas that fueled the movement. And King drew deeply within, on the Christian tradition, scripture, these sources that he was introduced to in seminary and in his PhD program. And he found sophisticated and creative ways to put these ideas to work in a way that transformed the world. And whether you're an educator, whether you are a community leader, whether you are a pastor, or whether you are a concerned citizen, he did what we are trying to do. So we need to do more than just grab quotes out of context, so that we can sound like we're on the right side, but to really understand what King was talking about, to understand the context that gave rise to these ideas. And so in order to do this, we have convened this group, a wonderful group. Gerald, Erica, and myself are going to just spend some time. We're basically going to have two big segments. An opening segment that'll be brief. We'll just spend some time making sure you understand a little bit about what was going on in America in '67 while King was writing this book, because it came out in '68. But the substance of our time will be, we'll spend about 45 minutes just, picking at various parts of the book, talking about some ideas and things that sort of resonate with us. And then we'll conclude that segment helping you to think critically and creatively about why this book is so important. Why are we having you read this book? It was written back in 1968. I think we're going to give you some real answers to that. And so I want to begin, and I'll just ask Gerald to give us some sort of opening comments, and then I'll follow up with him with just a few things I want to share on my screen. Gerald, when people are picking up this book, the temptation will be to not really understand the history behind the book, what fueled the book. And so what were some things going on in '67? Even if you want to go back a few years before that, the viewers need to kind of understand, because it just gives context to what King is trying to do in this book.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brogdon, and thank you, Dr. Cosby, for the invitation to come and be a participant on this panel. I would begin by simply saying that when we look at the modern civil rights movement, it has typically been period during the years from 1954 to 1968. Some scholars write 1954 to 1965, from the Brown decision to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in '65, or '68 to the assassination of King. The 1960s was a decade of unprecedented social change. Of course, in the early part of the decade, you have the various demonstrations, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, and so forth. By the time we get to the late 1960s, King's book comes out in January of 1967. That's when we, see the movement. Initially, scholars thought was going in a different direction, but in actuality, things were moving along as they had even during the Cold War period. And so 1965 is considered this demarcation with the Watts riot of 1965. And of course, King talks about that in the book in terms of 1966 is when Stokely Carmichael first talks about Black Power during the March Against Fear. So there are a number of things taking place. Obviously, big is the riots of 1965 in Watts, then 1967, several riots, and 66 and 67 in Detroit and Newark. You got the Kerner Commission that's coming out with its report in 1967 to sort of, provide some sort of rationale or reasoning for these urban uprisings that are taking place. A number of people are killed. So it's out of that climate of race riots, a continuation of political and economic inequality in America. And then, of course, it's right there in Louisville, Kentucky as well, with the open housing demonstrations and Martin Luther King coming to Louisville, given that his brother pastored the church there. And so King's in and out of Louisville quite often in the late 1960s. So he's very much aware of what's going on a national level. But not only that, when we think about this period of the 60s, it's considered to be the good years and the bad years. The good years were the years where you have these heroes who are engaged in civil disobedience and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voter Rights Act of 65. And then they're considered to be the bad years. And that's when 1966, when the Black Panther Party is organized, and this connection between Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement, and King is trying to address all of that as he continues to be a strong advocate of nonviolent direct action.
And that's fantastic. A lot of viewers probably don't know just how widespread riots were in '67. So you had riots everywhere from Tampa, Florida, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There were riots at Fisk in Nashville, San Francisco, Cleveland, Buffalo, Minneapolis, East St. Louis, New Haven, Milwaukee, as well as Detroit and Newark. So 67, hot time. Okay, it's a lot going on, a lot of sort of bringing us up to this moment. And in fact, I really see that there was a real cycle going on during this time that I think viewers need to kind of understand. That what you have is white resistance to calls for justice and equality on both sides, sandwiched between a lot of things happening. So King and many others have been working since the 50s, trying to bring real substantive change to America. And at every step of the way, they're met with resistance. So what you have going on, particularly in these major urban centers, is you have grinding poverty. I mean, you ought to look at the data of what unemployment looked like. It's horrible. You have a Black community that's really experiencing demoralization. So it's very much a part of what fueled the Watts riot. As well as disillusionment and pessimism. There's starting to be pushback in the Black community, particularly among young people. They're a little pessimistic about Black leaders and about the white community's willingness to really work for substantive change. That they're just concerned that we aren't going to do enough. They're going to always just try to do just enough to sort of pacify people and to not do the things that's going to bring real change. Police brutality, then that leads to widespread rioting, and then you'll get these kind of breakthroughs. Like, for example, you have the election of 2 Black mayors. And then what is that met with? That's met with another rash of white resistance to calls for justice and equality that you see. So whether it's King's work up in Chicago on one end, or later what King is doing down in Memphis, it's constant pushback. And I just think it's helpful to kind of understand the history behind what is fueling some of what it is that Dr. King is doing in this wonderful book. And so let's just kind of shift gears and spend some time unpacking some of what we're seeing going on in this book, where do we go from here? I just want to lift up just a few quotes that, I think you should pay attention to. I love how at the outset, and what I'm going to do is spend some time juxtaposing chapters 1 and 5. And in these chapters, they're titled, "Where Are We?" ? And then chapter 5 is "Where Are We Going?" So he spends time in the first part of that, the first chapter, really just doing a little history about some of the work that he has done. And then he wanted to point out the oddity that white Americans were, well, and we're talking about white progressives, were willing to work with him when it came down to, like, issues of integration, voting rights, etc. But when King began to shift his attention to really dealing with deeper issues of structural inequality, he started to find resistance even from progressive whites. All right. So I love this quote where he says, "White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination." So when African Americans were looking for white allies, what they were finding in '67 is that their white allies started to fade into obscurity. So King makes powerful statements like, "White America's never been truly committed to helping African Americans out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination." One of the things I love about King is King is about the pragmatics, some of the practical aspects of walking this out. He's not just some idealist. King has this wonderful theological vision of what America can be, but then he will hit you with some data that can say, well, here's how we get it done. And I just love, where he was quoting a report done in '66 that basically the cost of really implementing programs to fight poverty, ignorance, and slums, it's going to cost the country $1 trillion, which it could have done that in '66 and America would be a different country. But of course, they didn't do it. So you have this riveting question where he says, why is equality arduously avoided? Why does white America delude itself? And how does it rationalize the evil it retains? So he asked these sort of probing questions to then go into, his assessment of the sort of state of Black America. And you have Black Americans who are living in substandard housing. They have half the income of whites. Twice as many are unemployed. Infant mortality rates double that of whites. And I just thought the statistics about Blacks dying in Vietnam, that was startling. Twice as many. We're talking about the ones who are on the front lines, the folks who are getting killed. It's Black folk. And of all Blacks employed, 75% are holding what he calls menial jobs. So I think here he's showing that there are some real structural obstacles to justice that he wanted to spend some time pointing out, interrogating, and I think exposing. And so he starts to challenge the administration of Johnson. And so, man, that first chapter, I love what he did there, and just wanted to point out a couple really good quotes there. And then when he shifted gears to the 5th chapter, I just loved how he was talking about we need to place an emphasis on organizing ourselves, our political and social power. Couple good quotes. He says, the deeper truth is the call to prepare programs, because, anytime, they're pushing for change, you can have the white establishment says, well, we'll develop a report or develop some kind of program, and then we'll spend some time figuring out, if that program's good and if we can actually implement it. And really what all King is, he's exposing a system that just consistently tries to stall, to keep coming up with excuses and reasons not to do anything in the first place. And so what King is starting to see is that we have to organize ourselves so that we start doing things for ourselves, and how to better leverage ourselves and our interests within the sort of socio-political space in which we find ourselves. And that also means we have to find some more sophisticated ways to engage the political climate and the political system. And King was seeing that the sort of Democratic Republican, that sort of model has some real problems. You know, it doesn't always deliver substantive and structural change to African Americans. And this is very much a lively and hot issue today with the ADOS movement, the American Descendants of Slavery. So you see some of these same parallels. So I just really appreciated what King was doing, in these first two chapters. And those were some of the things I wanted to point out. Erica, what are some things you liked?
So there were many things to like, and also really many disturbing things, particularly in the chapter that you gave me, Dr. Brogdon. I found it really informative and helpful, and I'm going to try and share my screen here. So what I have is chapter 3, this racism and white backlash. And part of what was really disturbing for me is that the Martin Luther King quotes, because he wrote this book, weren't whitewashed in a way that made it palatable for me. And this language of white backlash was also a new term that I could not define on my own. So I had to reread this chapter several times. And the way that I have found Dr. King defining white backlash is a surfacing, or perhaps what we might even say today, a resurfacing. Maybe backlash is more like white backwash, this regurgitation of old prejudices, hostilities, and ambivalence that have always been there, caused neither by the cry of Black power, not by the unfortunate recent waves of riots. White backlash is an expression of the same vacillations, the same search for rationalization, the same lack of commitment that has always characterized white America on the question of race. You would have thought Dr. King was resurrected in 2020 and then wrote this chapter. It's very haunting. And that's what history does. And so where Dr. King is leading us, where do we go from here? I also wonder, where have we come from? And this is part of the ambivalence, this amnesia that white America has, is we have forgotten our own history. And oftentimes we personalize the history in such a way, or individualize our own history. We think that we can remove ourselves from the effects of history, or how history can show up once again. And I do think it's interesting that it is President's Day. I'm going to talk a little bit about the presidents in which Dr. King references, particularly during the time period of colonization, and where kind of the doctrine of white supremacy arose. Oftentimes, we're not given a really good definition of racism or even white supremacy. And I think Dr. King kind of outlines that well in this chapter. Dr. George Kelsey, whom he quotes, says, "Racism is a faith. It is a form of idolatry. Racism was a justificatory device for the constellation of political," and this is key, "and economic power, which were expressed in colonialism, and slavery." And this is the residue in which we are still seeing this economic power, white supremacy, where men had to convince themselves that a system which was so economically profitable was morally justifiable, a profitable system that gave birth to this doctrine of white supremacy. This is really key in a better understanding of our own American history, particularly when it comes to our founding fathers. And I really think Dr. King was rather delicate with some of our founding fathers. He was very gracious. While he did not heroify them, he was also able to call them out on what they were not able to do when it came to slavery, or when it came to emancipation, or when it came to changing government policies over a breadth of time. Virtually all of the founding fathers of our nation, even those who rose to the heights of presidency, were enmeshed in the ethos of slavery and white supremacy. And this includes George Washington. This includes Abraham Lincoln. This is the historical white backlash that we're seeing regurgitated generation after generation after generation, not only with our political leaders, but just with how we organize institutions themselves. So part of what he does, he gives this really great biblical illustration of the prodigal son returning home. And he actually calls for white America to return home in this kind of journey towards returning home, towards full equality. And what I appreciate about this chapter is that Dr. King is so pastoral in inviting white America into this work of not only reconciliation, but reparations and equality as well. Some of the things that he talked about specifically were painful when it comes to economics. He says, well, we will have to engage in radical reordering of national priorities. There is a striking absurdity in committing billions to reach the moon, which this is during the Cold War, during the 60s, where no people live, while only a fraction of the amount is appropriated to service of densely populated slums. And this is what you were talking about, Dr. Brogdon, as Dr. King kind of breaks down the poverty, what is taking place at this time. I thought this was particularly haunting. The recently revealed misestimate of the war budget amounts to $10 billion for a single year. The error alone is more than 5 times the amount committed to anti-poverty programs. If we reversed investments and gave the armed forces the anti-poverty budget, the generals would be forgiven if they walked off the battlefield in disgust. And part of this haunting number is that if you were to break down these figures in the 60s, and Lord knows what they are today, $332,000 would be spent on each of our enemies that we killed. I mean, the economics is where it really hits home. And this is where we are seeing this tension among kind of the progressives or the white liberals. And Dr. King spends a good amount of time on this. He says, Negroes have felt that of their most troublesome adversary was not the obvious Ku Klux Klan, but the white liberal. That was hard, hard to hear. And I'm a millennial, you know, of white colored skin, who considers themselves as a white liberal. Like, what is the work that I have to do? What is the work that we have to do around this? And how have we even blindsided ourselves to think that we may have been helping when we may have been more harmful? So this kind of journey towards full equality, it is not enough to say that we love Negroes. We have many Negro friends. If I could tell you time and time again as a pastor, as a predominantly white congregation, oh no, we don't have a race issue. I have lots of Black friends. Well, Dr. King is calling that out. That's not enough. That is not actually what love is. Love that does not satisfy justice is no love at all. Sentimental affections are little more than what one would have for their pet. and he says 2 things are clear, and I hope they are clear to the white liberals. Negroes cannot achieve emancipation through violent rebellion, but also by passively waiting for the white race to voluntarily grant it. I think these are just so applicable today, in how we understand King's words yesterday and King's words today. It is important for liberals to see that the oppressed person who agitates for his rights is not the creator of the tension. This is part of what we've been seeing over the past year with the Black Lives Matter movement, is with the riots, with the destruction of property. We are ending up blaming the movement, blaming this kind of pushing back, this agitation on the Black community, when it's actually, they're not at fault. What is taking place is a breaking down of the system. And this is part of what I hope we can discuss a little bit more of how this shows up on kind of the ground level. And I wouldn't be a good pastor, and Dr. King was an excellent pastor, if we didn't talk about the church. And he really does a great job of calling out the church. The church has a special obligation, is a voice of moral and spiritual authority on earth. The history of the church in America has been an accomplice in structuring racism in the architecture of American society. This is why it is so important, specifically for white churches, to have these conversations, to understand that the church has been an accomplice of this, and we have a role to play in the redemption of this work as well. Deeply rooted in our religious heritage is the conviction that every man is an heir to a legacy of dignity and worth, a dignity that is rooted in the biblical term, the image of God. And for Dr. King, the church has an opportunity and a duty to lift up this voice as a trumpet. So those were just a couple highlights. I hate to pull quotes, but I also wanted to pull quotes that people may have never heard from Dr. King before. So thanks, Dr. Brogdon.
Fantastic. Wonderful overview of a very powerful chapter. And Dr. Smith, I ask you to kind of spend some time unpacking the chapter where King talks about the Negro dilemma. And if you could talk about that and any allusions you could make to the chapter dealing with Black power as well would be appreciated. So, unmute your mic.
Yeah. In this particular chapter on the Negro dilemma, as I read that, I actually reread the book again. It's been a few years since I read it, so I had to go through it again. But one of the things that was really interesting to me is that King is actually coming full circle by the time he writes this book in when it's published in '67. We're not introduced to a new Martin Luther King. We're actually introduced to a king who already had the same philosophy going back into the early 1950s. My actual favorite document from King is basically a letter that he wrote to Coretta in July 1952 when they were dating. And it was very prophetic. And I draw back to that letter that he wrote to her in 1952, saying it's very prophetic, because the book that he writes in 1967 is very prophetic as well, in terms of where do we go from here? Chaos, do we want segregated chaos, or do we want community? Do we want an integrated, loving community? Do we want hope or do we want despair? That sort of thing. And he is very optimistic in terms of the way he sees his life as a young seminary student in 1952 when he's dating Coretta. And he's actually, just going into his second year at Boston University. And in that letter, we see a couple of things. We see her as an intellectual and we see him as an intellectual. And that's the letter that we published in volume 6. That was in Mrs. King's home, and no one had ever seen it before. It was a very personal letter in which he shared with her his thoughts on a book that she had given him on Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward. And in the letter, he tells her this in the closing part of the letter. He said, "Let us hope, work, and pray that in the future we'll live to see a warless world and a redistribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race and color." And then he closes with these words. He said, "This is the gospel that I hope to preach to the world." And so he is saying that in 1952. So then we come to 1967, and this redistribution of wealth that he's talking about, that he foresees, democratic socialism, all that comes forthright in '67 in that book. But also understand that in 1967, that, King is very unpopular. He had a 37% disapproval rate in '63. By 1966, you've got more than 60% of folks in America who disapprove of King's leadership. So the more unpopular that he becomes, the more prophetic that he shares with the world. in terms of who he is and where he sees his country going. And so when he looks at this dilemma of African Americans, it's actually reminiscent of W.E.B. Du Bois's writings on double consciousness, this two-ness that Du Bois writes about. And so King is writing about that, one, from the standpoint of that, African Americans were brought here as slaves, families were destroyed, they're already behind in the race, yet and still, they are expected to run evenly. And so that's his response to this sort of white backlash that King is talking about that evolves out of the Watts riot. I said 65, the Watts riot 66. But from that Watts riot, he mistakenly writes that there is this white backlash because from the Watts riot and with the Black Power movement, there's concern on his part that now goes white financial support and ideological support for the movement, and that's the last thing that he wants to see. And so he offers these challenges to African Americans and white liberals in general. And that's what I'm saying, that even though he's more unpopular by the late 1960s, he's even more courageous. He's even more prophetic, which means that he is willing to say anything from Lyndon B. Johnson all the way down to the brother that's pastoring in the church in the South, calling out not only African-American ministers, but he is also addressing those in the Black middle class and challenging them, what they need to do, and also challenging white liberals, because he realizes that African-Americans are experiencing this two-ness, this dilemma in life where they are expected to do more with less. And it's a reflection of the history that they've come out of. And so because of that dilemma, because of the stigma that has been placed upon them, because of the mountains that they still have to climb, because of the political and economic inequalities that they face, because of the continued police brutality, which he had spoken about in the 1963 speech, so police brutality, none of this is new to him. He's just as concerned about it as the Black Panther Party for self-defense. He's reckoning with this dilemma of nonviolence and self-defense, nonviolence and armed resistance. He's dealing. So that's all part of this dilemma. What do? We've witnessed, so many deaths and so many beatings, but yet and still, white America is expecting us to quote unquote stand down, stand back, all of that. And King is like, no. Now that what's interesting with all of this is that when you read the chapter on Black Power, you sort of get the impression that he is critical of Black Power. He did have concerns about the slogan, about the term, but it's very evident by the time we get to the Negro dilemma and the next chapter, where do we go from, where are we, and all that. It's clear that he's actually an advocate of Black power.
Yes, he is. Yep.
He just articulates it, in a different way in terms of how do we respond to the challenges we experience in this dilemma. And that's when he espouses the ideas of group unity. That's where he gets into the discussion, not only of group unity, but also, to use his word, this somebodyness in terms of, Black pride, understanding the importance of that, knowing African-American history. These were ideas that he had actually dealt with in the 1950s. Okay, so they're coming out in more detail in 1967. And as I was reading through that, even some of the sermon passages, I'm a pastor, so like many pastors and preachers, we know how to borrow from ourselves, right? And so King would often borrow from himself, just like preachers do. He had set pieces. And so when I look at where do we go from here, I see some of King's set pieces, things that he had preached about in the 1950s that he is now revealing again in 1967. He's got a sermon that he preaches in the early 1950s, accepting responsibility for your actions, Well, that's evident, that's clear in this particular book when he makes reference to Marian Anderson and Roland Hayes and how they did not let their environment hold them back, that actually they use their environment to propel them to do even more for their community. And so, I think it's important that when you look at these chapters, when you read this entire book, we're actually seeing now the complete unveiling of a young Martin Luther King in the 1950s with a much more mature Martin Luther King by 1967, who's not holding anything back. And he has an open and honest response to the Black Power. He says, I took a quote here, Black Power is a psychological reaction to the psychological indoctrination that led to the creation to the perfect slave. And understanding what America has done to African Americans psychologically. And King believes that we can address that issue, that problem, through power, understanding that there is not a disconnect between power and love, but there's actually a connection between power and love. And this power and love can be manifested significantly when we work together in coalitions. And this is the same thing, interesting, you see, that the Black Panther Party was doing. I mean, that's what Fred Hampton was doing with the Black Panther Party in Chicago, in 1968, 69, which made him a threat, which made King a threat, because by 67, 68, King is looking at coalition building, moving beyond civil rights to human rights and thinking about, okay, how can we bring together whites in Appalachia? How can we bring together Native Americans and, Mexican Americans, and bring together these different groups, understanding that we together wield a lot of power, that African Americans, have to not only address their own group identity issues, because he goes there talking about African American ministers. You're more concerned about the size of your wheelbase than you are the services in your community. He's very critical of white liberals. He said, you call yourself a white liberal, but you're more concerned with being, you're a white Christian. You're more concerned with being white than you are being a Christian. So, that's where the courage continues to show forth in 1967, and I really admire and respect him for doing that.
Yeah, Joe, that's a wonderful overview of two very, very powerful chapters, and for all of those who are watching all over the city, the region, and the nation, this is why you really need to read this book, because not only will it help you to understand America back then, but it's really going to help you to understand America today. What is very alarming when you're reading this is it's like, oh my gosh, it's as if Dr. King wrote that book in maybe the year before Barack Obama became president of the United States. And we have seen what has unfolded in this nation ever since. We're going to shift gears, and this will be our final segment. And then we're going to open it up and have some Q&A. So what you do is go ahead, put a question in the chat box. We've got folks who are looking at the chat box, and they'll get that question to me, and I will put these other two panelists on the hot seat. Send me all the easy questions, send them all the hard questions, and we'll just kind of spend some time chopping it up and discussing. But let's just, in this last segment, let's just say we've got 300 people who they haven't read this book, but they're like watching this forum and they're like, I think I might get that book. So let's push them, let's get them across the finish line and maybe talk about, why is this book so important in 2021? Why is this book so important? Erica, you go.
I'll let Erica go first. Yeah,
So I think the brilliance of Dr. King is that he brings these ideas, this truth that has kind of been forming in the universe down to the ground level. And this is why I think this book is so important, is that it is applicable now. We can do this work now. And he doesn't dismiss all the hard work that was done in the past. He actually, gives credit to the allies, the white liberal allies who did hard work. But he also doesn't say, that the work is complete. There is more work to do. And he gives it, legs. And that's what I appreciate about this book, because sometimes even in academia, we can get stuck in the clouds without kind of bringing it to where people are now. And I think this meets people where they are, particularly for institutions that are predominantly white, religious affiliations, communities that have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Gerald, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's very evident that what King was writing about in '67 is now discussed in a different vernacular. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, that's the same thing King was saying, in 1967. So for people who are wrestling with, well, what does that mean? Well, King articulates that very clearly in this book, what Black Lives Matter. White privilege. What is white privilege? You want to know what white privilege is? Read King's book. Where do we go from here? Interesting. Mike Dyson in his book, I may not get there with you. In the first, I think it's the first chapter in the book, he writes about that there should be a 10-year moratorium on the "I Have a Dream" speech. That
Amen. I agree.
That for 10 years, we shouldn't have to hear it. We shouldn't read it. Anything shouldn't be taught in classrooms or whatnot. Which is quite interesting because, and the point is that that's where we freeze Martin Luther King in 1963.
Yes.
And generations of children are growing up learning those words, those 34 words, where he focuses on judged by the content of your character rather than the color of your skin, all that. But it's a segment that passes in 34 words. But the whole thing is that we need to read more of King's other writings.
Yes.
And so here is a compact way of learning about King's writings, and it's not complex at all. It's very simple. The thesis is straightforward. You know where he's going, right away. But again, it's very, very, very prophetic. I mean, that's what touches me. He preached a sermon in 1952, preached again in 1953. That's evident in this book. And the sermon, he gave it two different titles, using the same text. That's what I'm talking about. Preachers borrowing from themselves, same text, same structure, different title. And, he preached, rediscovering precious values. He called it rediscovering lost values. And then he preached it going forward by looking backward. And he preaches from Luke chapter 2, where Jesus's parents leave him and they have to go back and get him. And what King does is that, he focuses on in that book how we have as a society, from a material and intellectual standpoint, we have made tremendous advances. But when it comes to our moral progress, we have declined, we have diminished. And so that's evident today in terms of as he goes forward, in one of those versions of that sermon, saying that we have made the world a neighborhood, but we haven't made it a brotherhood. We've made it a neighborhood because, you can get on a plane and, in a couple of hours, be across the United States, but we still have yet to make it a brotherhood. So just how all of that comes together in this particular book. So in this book, you can get some of King's sermons. You can get, some of his thoughts on interracialism, on the Christian church, on white liberals. I mean, it's all nicely and neatly packaged in this book.
That's wonderful, Gerald. When I was thinking about why I think people should read this book, a couple of things really stood out. And I want to begin with two quotes from that final chapter. The first quote, he says, "One of the great liabilities of history is that all too many people fail to remain awake through great periods of social change." And I just think that's a prophetic statement. Not only were there a lot of people on the wrong side of history in the 50s and the 60s, after Dr. King dies, after pieces of legislation have been passed and things get incrementally better, then you have all these people who realize they were on the wrong side of history, like, oh, well, you know, if I'm sorry for what I did back then. And we keep repeating these same patterns. So there's a movement going on in this world right now. And the problem is that too many people are asleep. You know, you're just doing your little family thing, doing your little job thing. We're in a cultural revolution, and so many people, they don't even know it. And so when you have masses of people all over the country and literally all over the world pouring out into your streets, and you see the kind of political and social upheaval that's playing itself out, we are in a special moment. And I'm like ding a ding a ding a ding, trying to ring the bell and wake people up so that we're not sleep through this, but also that we get on the right side. Because I'm going to be honest, and Erica pointed out in one of her slides, the church has a bad history, okay, being on the wrong side of slavery, on the wrong side of Jim Crow segregation. We're on the wrong side of the system of mass incarceration. We're on the wrong side of the reparations discussion. So that quote really spoke to me. And then I really thought, and Gerald pointed this out, as he really started to, and I think this is a very critical point he's making, that there's a sort of gulf in the 60s between scientific progress and moral progress. And Dr. King isn't some member of the religious right. He is a prophetic moral leader. And he saw that the country had lost its way. And I think in a very real sense, we're in that exact same predicament today. America, we have lost our way completely. And we need moral leaders, okay? And a part of the acute problem we have today is that sometimes we have religious leaders who aren't really moral leaders. They're part of the establishment. They're part of the status quo that's feeds the oppression. And so we have technology, we have social media, and King was talking about the threat of nuclear war. You ought to look at the documentary, The Social Dilemma. You know the problems we have with misinformation. You know the problems that these things that we have created have spiraled out of our control. And now these are the very things undermining the fabric of society. King says without some kind of reawakening, we are going to destroy ourselves. All right. And so I'm not worried about the nuclear football. Look at the problem we have with misinformation, with bots, with artificial intelligence, and just how polarized we are, how tribalistic we have become with our two-party political system. But I think in addition to this, I wanted to point is that I think King was giving us a warning and we did not listen. Because King was trying to help this country to understand this sort of capitalistic system where you lock out masses of people and you privilege just a few, that kind of society is going to implode on itself. He says you cannot keep people locked out of the earthly kingdom of wealth, health, and happiness. Either they share in the blessings of the world or they will organize to break down and overthrow those structures or governments which stand in the way of their goals. This is a treacherous foundation for a world house. Racism can well be that corrosive evil that will bring down the curtain on Western civilization. Yeah, that sounds like, it sounds extremist. It sounds alarmist. Look what happened on January the 6th. Look what's happening in our streets. Literally, the country was on fire. Militia groups, standoffs all across this country. These are things that's happening in what we call this highly advanced civilized society that we have become in the United States of America. We are literally crumbling at the seams, and it's because we did not listen. Oh, but we love the I have a dream quote, the end of that, instead of really thinking about what King was really trying to help us to understand, that we need to build a better America. And I want to end with Dr. King's wife, who I very much see Coretta as a major leader in the civil rights movement, and an intellectual leader in her own right. And in the forward, she just made not only did she make some wonderful statements about what King stood for and what he was doing in the book, but I think she kind of offers us some hope. I love how she pointed out that King discusses poverty as a source for world instability. And so I would encourage you to really spend some time researching the history of empires that try to, for extended periods of time, to have this sort of lopsided wealth equation where you have a very, very small group of people who are hoarding up all the resources. And this is very much what America is becoming. It usually doesn't end well. So we have some things we really need to think about, I think, here in the coming years. I love that she says it is our common tragedy that we have lost his prophetic voice, but what compounds it is if the lessons he did articulate are now ignored. And the caricature compounds his assassination, which is why I'm so thankful for people like Dr. Smith and the work that they do in helping people to really dig deeper into Dr. King's writings and his legacies, because as Coretta leaves us, and I believe Coretta is standing in the Black womanist theological tradition, she argues that what King is talking about in this book can still save our society from self-destruction. That is a powerful statement, and I think that's a helpful place to sort of end, and that gives us some hope. All right, so now I get the wonderful privilege of putting my colleagues on the hot seat, and we've asked some members of Empower West to get us started with the questions. And so I'm going to pitch a question to you, Gerald, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. Joe Phelps had a question about the second chapter when Dr. King was talking about Black Power. And Phelps saw that King disagreed over any allusions to using violence, and then this idea that you need this sort of separate community. So, but were those King's main objections? Were there any other objections to Black Power, and how did the conflict over the Black Power movement sort of play out in his life? And I don't mind jumping in on this as well. So, did he have any other objections about the Black Power movement?
Well, he was very much concerned with possible violent connotations associated with the term Black Power. He preferred power of the people rather than Black Power. That was a concern just in terms of people hearing that term and identifying some relationship with violence. He's very much concerned about the whole idea of separatism. And he thought that by separating ourselves from everyone else, whether it be in a separate state or segregation, that this would not be enough to sort of sustain the African-American community, that we needed to work together. And so it was self-defeating as far as he was concerned. The other concern that he had about Black Power was that Black Power basically imitating white power, in the sense of, because Black Power it revolved around masculinity. And did we want to sort of recycle a system that was already in place? And that's why in the book, he makes quite a bit of reference to creative dissenters. Yeah, creative dissenters. And we ought to be creative dissenters rather than trying to mimic something that is already in place. Creative dissenters, in other words, that we need to go to another level than simply espouse Black Power.
That's fantastic. And I would like to add on the second part of that question, Joe, how did the sort of conflict play out in his life? Well, I do want to point out that one of the things I love about Dr. King, not only as a sort of religious leader, but an intellectual leader as well, is that King actually listened to them, and would engage with them. There is footage of a march one time, and you've got King and Stokely walking side by side, and Stokely's talking Black Power, and then they'll give Dr. King the mic, and King will give not agreeing with something Stokely is saying, but still being able to march together. And I really respect Dr. King for doing that, because a lot of sort of Black leaders today, they just like to surround themselves with people who are just sounding boards, people who completely agree with them. And so we can't do coalition building, because our model of coalition building is everybody has to see everything our way. And King shows you a model where we can all march together and we're trying to work together. But I'm in a different place on these issues. But on some issues we could try to work together, we'll continue to do that. And I think you saw some movement with King where he saw some value in what they were doing in the Black Power movement. And he was able to affirm those points, but then also, clarify some points where there was disagreement. So that's one of the things I really appreciated about.
If I could just add one other thing to that, just to kind of follow up with what you said, which is great. What we also have to keep in mind as we read this book and look at what's happening in 66, during that march against fear, we have to think about the fact that Stokely Carmichael is 24 years old. and Martin Luther King is 37 years old, right? So they're both still young, but King is 13 years older than Stokely Carmichael. Yeah. And so they're engaging in this conversation. In the middle of all that, you have, Floyd McKissick, who takes over SNCC. And, Floyd McKissick and Stokely Carmichael and Whitney Young, they're all on Meet the Press in 1966. King has to leave early. And Floyd McKissick says, that nonviolence is something of the past, and this is in 1966 when he says it. So King is having to deal with all those different kind of, ideologies. And when I say different kind of ideologies, because King correctly notes that that Black power in itself is its own nuance, that the Black power means different things to different people.
Yes.
So how do you negotiate all of that, whether it's from a cultural standpoint, whether it's from international perspective, Black American anti-colonialism? We haven't even gotten to that. All that is part of Black power.
Yes.
Which actually evolves out of the Cold War years, where you get to Robert Williams and self-defense, all part of Black power.
Mm-hmm. Class is in session, people. All right, we've got probably 27 minutes to answer your question. So this is your time. You may have read something in the book and it didn't quite make sense, and you want to get that question in the chat box so they can get that question to me. Erica, I'm gonna throw a question your way. The question is this: if changing the economic system is where white liberals and others say that's going too far, what are the strategies for changing economic systems and ending poverty?
So there's been some valuable lessons I've learned through relationships, particularly with you, Dr. Brogdon, Dr. Cosby, being a part of Empower West, is how to get money, economic power into the Black community, and how to let the Black community use those resources how they will. I think this has been part of the dilemma historically within America, is that we think we might be helping, and by we, I mean white progressives, by, giving philanthropically towards different causes. But then oftentimes we don't know how to step aside and just trust that they're going to use those resources according to how they can do it. I mean, this is also part of what we've seen historically been really destructive for the Black community, like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, when their economy just collapsed. Instead of rebuilding that, we didn't put pressure on the government to actually justify that wrong. This is also a word that nobody likes to use, particularly within white institutions: reparations. How do we actually, repair economic fault for hundreds of years that have impoverished generation after generation with actual money. I think policies are really important, but economic building within the Black community is really crucial. And then trust that they're going to use those resources according to how they need to use it without us influencing with our own agendas. So I think that's one really practical application of moving funds, moving wealth into communities, and trust their own leadership to do that.
That's a wonderful point. We have a question from another guest that pointed to a quote on page 13, which was in chapter 1, where Dr. King was talking about, we are encountering just such an experience today. The inevitable counter-revolution that succeeds every period of progress is taking place. Failing to understand this as a normal process of development, some Negroes are falling into unjustified pessimism and despair. Focusing on the ultimate goal and discovering it still distant, they declare no progress at all has been made. Then he goes on to say, this mood illustrates another fact that has been misinterpreted. A final victory is an accumulation of many short-term encounters. Too lightly dismisses success because it does not usher in a complete order of justice is to fail to comprehend the process of achieving full victory. And the question is does this resonate for you in 2021? And I'll jump on this one and say, yes. To me, what King is getting at, he's getting at two important issues. The first issue is the nature of what it is we are combating. I like to use, as a New Testament scholar, I like to use the apocalyptic image of the beast out of the book of Revelation, as John was using this apocalyptic language to understand what happens when you get social, political, and militaristic power all coming together and the widespread oppression that it exacts upon masses of people. So he uses the language of the beast. And when you're talking about colonialism and slavery and what it has produced in this country, it is a literal monster. It's a beast. The more you understand how sophisticated, how deeply entrenched it is, how widespread it is, then you're confronted with the fact that you can't change it all overnight. And when you care about humans, when you care about human suffering, then it's hard to accept that suffering is going to continue. Disenfranchisement is going to continue while we're chipping away at it, while we're making a difference and doing everything we can to push against this system. So these sort of moments of despair, I think that's inevitable if you want to understand the nature of what it is to do this work. But I think King is also getting at something that's a particular problem within Black America that I talk about in my book, Hope on the Brink, where I unpack the issue of nihilism within Black America. The fight against racism is not only at the systemic level, but there's also that internal work we have to do within the Black community, because what happens is if we don't have those buffers and those safeguards and those institutions in place to protect African Americans from the constant assault of racism, then the temptation is Blacks will internalize their own racism and then participate in their own oppression. And so we see that getting played out in a lot of sophisticated ways, whether it's internalizing despair, internalizing self-hatred, Black on Black crime, whether you have the prosperity pimps. I mean, it looks a lot of different ways, and I talk about it because what some people, they give up hope that you can do anything substantive with this system. So I think King is getting at something that's a particular problem. I think some of the outrage that manifests itself in destruction of property during protests, there are segments of the community that just don't care because they don't see things changing. And I think that's why that book is so important. That chapter is important because as justice leaders, not only do we have to continue the fight on that sort of external level, we got to do some real hard internal work within the Black community to make sure that we are okay and that we are in a good place while we're continuing what is a very, very difficult fight. Any others wanted to kind of chime in on that point? I just thought that quote, that really resonated with me. Great question.
Yeah, I can just kind of piggyback on that a little bit. Because, as you read the book, you'll see how he very meticulously develops his argument throughout the book. And so even though that quote is, early on, page 13, when you get to that chapter on the dilemma of the Negro, then he really responds to that, more clearly when he talks about how we should respond to the challenges of what was articulated on page 13. And that's where, he makes a strong case that, what we cannot afford to do is be negative, be self-destructive, drop out of school, become a drug addict, an alcoholic. That's when he goes into more detail about, separatism and become isolated. Nope, we don't want to do that. And that's a concern with Black Power, that we're moving in that direction. And that's where he writes about don't let oppression, if I remember correctly, shackle your mind. And then he moves into the discussion about group identity and group unity, and all of that is actually Black Power, self-determination, with Black pride. All of that is packaged in there, because he is saying that we've got to come together. When he talks about the Black church, and he's specifically talking about African American now, the Black church, he references the Black press, as well as Black professional organizations, fraternities, and sororities. And that's one of the things that I have wrestled with now in 2021. I understand the significance of coalition building, but I think we have been very negligent in terms of strengthening our own communities. And that's where my head is right now.
Good point.
That I'm trying to think about ways in which we in the African American community, the faith community, education, the list goes on and on. Okay, we've got to come together. We've got to strategize. We've got to plan what we are going to do. And that's what, and even King admits this in that chapter, how he admired the Black Muslims, for what they were doing. We talk about this contestation between Malcolm and King. No, they were actually very much alike. Which is the irony.
That's good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you, Gerald, for following up with that. We've got a question here. It says, in the book introduction section, it asks, what is considered to be the deepest question? Who are we and who we are meant to be? They're just asking, what are your thoughts on that as King, puts out those two big questions? Who are we and who are we meant to be?
I've talked a lot. Go ahead, Eric. I mean, I'll go for it, but no, I need to shut up,
No. Y'all doing great. Great.
No, gosh, I yield to someone who's been studying this for a very long time. So I can answer that in a couple of ways, and I will answer it more pastorally. We are all loved children of God, and I think that is part of what I'm drawing out of King's words here, is that we have morphed the image of God based upon the image of the dominant, supreme kind of, for lack of a better term, race, although white is not a race technically. That's a different panel. And if we're all loved children of God, and if what racism is, this faith or ideology, this kind of mutant disease that morphs the image of God in the other, then we all can't be loved children of God, and we all can't be in community. And this is part of the kind of psychological dilemma here, is that after generation, particularly for white people, this enmeshment we can't see this myopia, this kind of dystopian world that has been created based upon this disease of white supremacy, of racism, has blinded us in a way that we know no other way. And it's created this kind of dystopian myopia of how we approach everything. And so unraveling that to the core, which I believe comes down to remembering that we are all children of God, and starting there again, I think is really pivotal. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, and I'll throw in one quick comment there. You know, one of the things King was calling for, and he even mentioned it in his speech entitled "Where Do We Go From Here?" is, you know, he was really pushing for kind of what he insisting on, a restructuring of the whole of society. So whether, you know, so as an educator, you know, this is why I love being in the classroom. You know, I love being in the classroom because, you know, I want students to kind of understand their world, because then as they're thinking about what they're majoring in and what they want to do with their lives, their calling, their path is to go out and to take up this work. And this is why King's work is so important. This is why I believe there should be a class on King at every college, every university in this country, because we can never get to the restructuring, we need a different approach. And that's going to take some time to get there. We're going to need, you know, that's everything from policies to new approaches to doing business, finance, education. I mean, so we talk about curriculum, housing. I mean, so that's the work that we're going to be doing going forward. And it's more than just rah-rah speeches and protests. It's going to be a lot of, really trying to organize ourselves. How do we organize power? How do we use that power? How do we leverage that power to create real change? And how do we develop these models that we can then scale out incrementally? You know, in 25 years, these are some specific goals. We can be here. Then in 50 years, we can be here. And that's the path. That's the challenge that's before us. And it's amazing that King can just throw two questions out like that, but that it invites that level of reflection. All right, I got a great question coming from Paula McCraney. She says, chapter 6, when he was talking about the great liabilities of history, the comment about remaining awake, please speak to how we who think we are woke can get others to stay awake and at the same time keep our young people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they're sick and tired of waiting, to be patient with the process. At the same time, how can we encourage protesters and others to celebrate the wins when we get them? And I'll stop there because she got a long question, but what she hit you with right off the bat, that's a lot to chew on. Okay, so the folks who are like either woke or semi-woke, how do we help others who aren't to kind of wake up and encourage people who are woke, who are tired of waiting? You know, how do we do all that? Okay, help us.
Yeah, well, I'm an educator, and obviously I strongly believe in education. Believe in reading, and one of the things we have to do is we have to start early. We've got to. When I say start early, that's where it comes in, the training and the education and the reading, the importance of reading and listening. And we as African Americans, we come out of an oral-based culture, and so the more information that we receive, the more that we can communicate that to the next generation. And sometimes you can do this in very unique and creative ways. For example, some of you no doubt remember the comic strip cartoon that was on television, The Boondocks. And you remember The Boondocks, and the Boondocks had a controversial episode titled "The Return of the King," which was the return of Martin Luther King. And just very quickly, the story was about Martin Luther King having been assassinated, and he was unconscious for 20 years. And then he wakes up and he sees what's going on, right? And so He's looking at how his name has been commercialized. He's looking at hip hop music, listening to the hip hop music, and looking at what's happening on BET and all of that. And it ends. I don't know if any of you all have seen that, but it ends in a very dramatic fashion. So if you haven't seen it, you got to take a look at it, because it addresses the question of, who are we and where do we go from here, but also how we connect with the next generation. And King dealt with the same thing, is that, okay, there were those who were members of SNCC in particular, this younger generation who had lost confidence in not only nonviolent direct action, and he had to keep them engaged somehow, but saying, look, nonviolent direct action has worked. Look what we have accomplished, right? We still have work to do. And that's what the book essentially says, is that, we've got more work to do. We've got to, continue to engage in voting rights. We've got to work even harder, towards, economic equality. Understand that the closer we get, the more difficult it's going to be. And we see that with voter registration and in terms of what we have to do regarding voter suppression and all of that. King saw the whole thing, which made him even more prophetic. And what saddens me is that, okay, it's not in the school system. Well, that's where we come in, in terms of whether it's in our churches or other special programs that are set up, that we educate this next generation. I had my kids watching Roots, when they were little kids during the summer, and writing reports, and getting them engaged, hooking them early on. Because, as you and I know, after people get to a certain age, a lot of them, lose interest. And that's what King was addressing.
Yep.
Said, hey, don't get caught up in that negativism. You got to know, how far we come. That's why history is so important. So we can't just do this in January and February. Obviously in July and August, we've got to continue to be engaged in this whole discussion. I mean, it frustrates me to hear people talk about, oh, we're all in this together. We need to love each other. Well, my goodness, King was saying all of that stuff, over 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I want to encourage participants. I wrote an article entitled "Leading in a Windstorm" that was published in Black Politics Today this past December. And one of the things I was talking about was that we have this leadership model today that really people just think being a good leader means you can do deconstructive work. And deconstructive work basically means you know how to explain the nature of the problem. And pretty much everything's wrong. Everybody has a problem. Then when it comes around time to doing something constructive, then they don't have anything to say, but don't follow them. Don't listen to them. That's wrong. That's wrong. There's a problem with this. But you've got to take a page out of the biblical tradition, and you have to learn how to celebrate victories. And I talk about this, and the model comes right out of the first chapter of Genesis, where you have a creation story that takes 7 days. Okay, and so after each day, God will celebrate what God did on that day, knowing everything wasn't done, but this part was good. And we have to learn how to start celebrating some of the progress that we're making, because if we don't do that, then we're going to get too tired, too discouraged, too bitter. And so if you listen to King's 67 speech, where do we go from here? He will tell you all the specific things that they were doing in all the different places. And we need, this is why I believe we need a Nehemiah model of leadership in the Black community, because we just don't need Moseses. We need people who are strategists, who are planners, who are builders, and who understand incremental change. Because when you understand incremental change, you need to say, okay, here's what we've done. We got this, because people need to feel good about that. And we need to find ways to celebrate that in the Black community. Okay, we have done this, and we have a win here. A lot of people don't even know about the wins. They don't know about policies that have been passed. All they know is what hasn't been done. And that's some of what we have to change. And that's something I take away from Dr. King's work here. I got a heavyweight question, and it might end up being the last one, depending on how it goes. And Dr. Cosby, if you're listening and you want to jump in on this, I would love to have you jump in as well, because it's that good. And we'll start by putting Erica on the hot seat with this, because it really is that good. The question is this: is it too late to bring Christians in America together in a shared movement to create a society based on love, justice, and equity? Is it too late?
Well, this happens to be my PhD work, so. So Dr. Brown, as you were talking about the first chapter of Genesis, if I were to correlate a white liberal to, particularly a white liberal Christian, to a character in the Bible, it would be Peter. Peter, the zealot, who is ready to jump out of the boat, ready to do these things, is very kind of angry to some degree, wrestling with some internal stuff. But then when it comes to actually doing the hard work of sticking through it towards the end, all the way to the cross, Peter drops the ball. Like, white Christians drop the ball. White liberal Christians drop the ball. I mean, painfully sometimes, embarrassing, lots of shame around that. But the best part about Peter's story is, not all the work he does in Acts and things like that, but it's the interaction he has with Christ, where he returns to breakfast, with Jesus. And Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, do the work, get back in the arena, go back in there." And so this is why I remain a pastor of a predominantly white congregation, is that we can be part of the redemptive work of God's love. And that, particularly with white liberal Christians, we don't have to feed on righteous anger. We can feed on ridiculous redemptive love. And that's where our energy can come from. And just like you were saying, Dr. Brogdon, we don't have to lose our energy, lose our fight when we fail. We can rise back up, because we're going to time and time again, and we're going to be corrected, and we're going to be criticized, and it's going to be embarrassing, and we'll need to see our own therapist for it, but it's going to be okay. And that's my hope for the church, particularly for the white church, is to get back in the arena time and time again.
Dr. Cosby, is it too late?
Well, it's not too late for God.
Amen.
But it may be too late for the church as we know it. That might not be the tool in God's toolbox to bring forth the transformative change that we need. Sometimes God has to use non-Christians to Christianize non-Christian Christianity. So, God has to use folk outside the church to do the work of the church. So to restrict God to quote unquote Christians who have not truly been Christian, all I know is that the kingdom of God, the will of God, will ultimately prevail, but the channel might not be the institutional church as we know it. Bear Bryant, who was the coach many years at Alabama, in his book called Bear, he said that he was wanting to integrate the University of Alabama football team, but there was so much recalcitrance against by the racist. So he strategically played USC, and they had a running back called Sam the Bam Cunningham, and he ran 4 touchdowns on the Crimson Tide. And in his book Bear, in his autobiography, he said that Sam the Bam Cunningham did more to integrate the state of Alabama with those 4 touchdowns than all of the churches and all of the marches of Martin Luther King Jr. So maybe God use Sam the Bam Cunningham. Maybe God might use a football game. I don't know how God's going to work that thing out. But in the words of James Baldwin, I think white folk have been white too long. And it is the white supremacist impulses are so ingrained in the psyche of white people. You know, critical race theorists say basically two things. Number one, that racism is ingrained in the psyche of white people. And by racism, I mean this: a structural arrangement in which whites are in a position of domination and blacks are in a position of subordination. That is structural racism, and it is fueled by wealth inequality, maintained by wealth and power inequality. Secondly, critical race theorists say we cannot overcome point one because we refuse to acknowledge it. We are in denial. So when you have a 1619 project, you're going to have pushback and white resistance with the 1776 project because we don't want to know the truth. So, and no one undergirds this system of inequality like the church. Before the states fought in 1861 and divided, secularly speaking, the denominations were dividing in 1845, like the Southern Baptists, the Methodists. Right here in Louisville, they separated in Louisville, Kentucky in 1846. So it was though the church taught the state how to divide over the issue of racism. And as long as you've got 81% of white evangelicals being apologists for someone like Donald Trump, I think it's kind of late in the day in terms of whether or not the church can truly be the force of redemption and change. You know.
Yeah, and you need a conversation that you have both sides of that. Gerald, you want to jump in on that?
I know our time is spent. There are so many different directions I could go in because Dr. Cosby, I teach race in sports. So that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, you know, as I was listening, I thought about James Cone's book on Black theology and Black power. And, you know, how in the book he actually, you know, blames whites for Black oppression and what they're going through. He's very critical of whites in that book, and even compares them to the George Wallaces of the day. So that book, Cone's book, comes out in '69, just 2 years after King's book. And I'll close with these two comments. You know, first of all, you know, King said toward the end of his life that one, America was a racist country. That's another quote we don't pick up from. And then two, that because America was founded by white slave owners, that America has a lot of, quote unquote, in his words, repenting to do. That's the second thing that he said. But King also, you know, very clearly understood that that it was very necessary for us, when I say us African Americans, to call out not only white racists but white liberals as well. Yeah. A few months ago, I preached a sermon at Pilgrim. I titled it "Dangerous Christians," and I know that's an oxymoron. I went into that, but I talked about Peter and Paul and how Peter refused to eat with the Gentiles when the Jews showed up. And, you know, just how we, and I won't get into the whole sermon, but just, you know, how Paul had to literally call him out and let him know, like, no, that's not wrong. So it's incumbent upon us, you know, who do consider ourselves to be progressives or whatnot, to have the courage to call out folk and, you know, educate them, but yet and still, you know, provide them with the help and hope that our nation needs.
Friends, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Cosby, for jumping in on that. I had to have you weigh in on that. This has been a rich, rich conversation. Gerald and Erica, thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
Lewis, you did a good job.
Thank
friends,
you, brother.
If you don't have this book, please order this book and spend some time reading it. Erica, we're going to do a follow-up event on this book next Monday. I think Empire West is going to be doing something on it. So If you get a chance to read it and you want to follow up with us, join us on next Monday. So on behalf of Simmons College of Kentucky and Empower West, thank you for joining us. We're signing off. Have a good night.